US and Russian officials are holding talks in Saudi Arabia to negotiate a potential end to the war in Ukraine, but no European or Ukrainian delegates are involved in the negotiations. Meanwhile, European leaders met in Paris for urgent talks on Ukraine and European security. French President Emmanuel Macron called for a coordinated response, stressing that lasting peace in Ukraine can only be achieved if Russia calls off its aggression and Ukraine receives credible security assurances. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz highlighted the importance of meeting NATO's 2% defence spending target, while UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer emphasised that US security support is crucial for European support and for preventing further Russian aggression. Danish PM Mette Frederiksen also warned of Russia's threat to European security. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Zelensky went to Turkey to meet with President Erdogan. They discussed prisoner swaps and rebuked the US for trying to please Moscow during negotiations. He also warned of Europe's military vulnerability. Joining us to discuss this topic, we're first joined by Ross Feingold, who is a political analyst joining us from Taiwan. Ross, we're looking at some talks which are currently ongoing between the United States and, of course, Russia. This is, of course, good for Russia. It's seen as a media win for them, given they're at the table and Ukraine aren't. But looking geopolitically, what are the impacts of these talks?
It remains to be seen how the European leaders are really going to approach this. Obviously, they held a meeting on Monday. They're very concerned about their exclusion, as well as Ukraine's exclusion. But ultimately, the United States is still the leader of the West and the free world. And the European countries are probably going to have no choice but to go along with what the United States negotiates, assuming that the United States does get Russia to make some concessions in the interest of some kind of ceasefire agreement. But I think it will be very difficult for the Western European countries to say we're not accepting what the US has negotiated with Russia.
Yes, Andrea Lucidi is also joining us. He's a war reporter from Moscow. Andrea, thank you very much for your time. I want to get an understanding of how these talks and these initial peace talks are being viewed within Russia. What is the consensus that you're seeing?
For Russia, of course, this is a big success for their foreign politics, because for Russia, for the Russian population now, it's clear that all this game is directed from Washington, and now Washington want to talk with Russia, and this is the main goal that the foreign diplomacy, foreign politics of Russia reached now. It's very probably that now the foreign ministry of Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, and the American delegation are talking about some concession or some issues that both parties they have. But of course, in the Russian media in these hours, we are seeing that the main issue that we have is the totally exclusion of the European Union from these talks. That means that the geopolitical zone, European Union, that was involved in the support of Ukraine, and some leaders of European Union that are was talking more about the war against Russia, are not involved in the peace and the possible peace agreement. And this, of course, can be a political catastrophe for the European Union in their foreign politics.
Yes, and I'd like to build on that. Also joining us is Keith Vaz, the chairman of the Integration Foundation, who's joining us from London. Keith, thank you very much for your time. I want to look at that conversation that happened yesterday between European leaders. Sir Keir Starmer was one of those in attendance. Is there a wedge that's being driven between the EU and their partners and their historical partners in the US? And do you think that meeting shows that unity within the EU will still hold strong despite these talks that are going on without them?
Good morning from London. I think that this is a very important moment in the history of Europe, the United States' relationship with us, and for Ukraine. I think we should welcome the fact there are going to be peace talks, and they're happening as we speak. But we're playing in the European Union and outside, because of course Britain is no longer in the EU, we're playing catch up. And what worries me more than anything else is there seems to be a lack of daily communication between the American administration and people like Keir Starmer, Macron, and the German Chancellor. And I think that's the worrying part. That's the long-lasting part. Trump is a very transactional leader. He wants to make sure that he does the deal because he wants to go down in history as the president who sorted out this problem. And I think that Ukraine must welcome this, Russia must welcome this. Everyone has their own agenda. Nobody's going to just roll over and accept everything that the United States says. But for the first time, we're hearing about the cost of the deal, the fact that America will expect certain transactions if they're going to guarantee security. And for the first time, I'm hearing that the European Union and Great Britain actually loaned Ukraine the money rather than gave it. Well, I mean, this is coming from Washington, so it may or may not be true, but money now features in any solution to this agonizingly difficult problem. But I think that for everyone involved, it's welcome news that people are sitting down and discussing it. Maybe it's not all the right people. You can't discuss Ukraine, in my view, without Ukraine being at the table. But clearly, Russia and America have decided that they want to do this deal initially themselves before they involve other people in. But the European leaders, it's not just the European Union, it's Britain as well. We've really got to get our act together if we want to be seen to be part of the solution, rather than just be consulted after it's all done. And I think President Macron has attempted to do this. Keir Starmer's going over to America next week as a kind of bridge, though I would imagine someone like the President of France would want to deal with the President of the United States himself. So there's a lot going on, and that's why we need to make sure that we don't play catch up. We have clear principles, clear values in support of Ukraine, in support of peace. I think everyone wants peace, and that's how we should go forward. So the red lines for the European Union and Ukraine need to be written down pretty fast and communicated to Secretary Rubio and indeed to the President himself.
Yes, Ross Feingold, I'd like to pick up on a point that Keith Vaz made there in terms of the finances and the cost of this. Of course, European leaders have spoken about needing to increase their defence spending, but there also could be further spending with troops being stationed in Ukraine as part of any peace deal. Supposed army of Europe has been suggested by Zelensky. How feasible do you think that is?
It's very difficult for the European countries to deploy sufficient military forces to really be an effective peacekeeping force. That's just the honest truth. There's been a chronic underinvestment in the militaries of Western Europe. Some of them have invested more in certain services or equipment rather than the kinds of services and equipment that are going to be needed to maintain a peacekeeping force along what is a very long front. But President Trump is probably going to put pressure on the European countries to undertake that role, however weak they might be when it comes to actual resources to do that. I don't think President Trump really has an interest in putting U.S. forces on the front line as a peacekeeping force, although there's been some discussion about potential U.S. involvement with critical minerals and putting troops on the ground to protect critical minerals in Ukraine. That remains to be seen. But when it comes to being a peacekeeping force between the Ukraine army and the Russian army, I think Trump is going to be very reluctant to do that. And the burden, for better or worse, is going to fall on the Western European countries.
Yes, Andrea Lucidi, looking at future talks that might take place, we know, of course, currently Ukraine and the European Union and the UK are not involved. But how quickly do you think, following these talks that are happening right now in Saudi Arabia, we'll see everybody get around the table? Or is it not in Russia's interest to do so?
It's very hard to reply to this question. The Russian sources are saying that a meeting between President Putin and President Trump is planned till the end of this month. But of course, the real the reality is depend on which will be the result of the meeting of today and the future meeting between the two delegations that will be happen in these days, in the next days. About a future peace agreement, I can say that it's very improbable that Moscow can change their request to the West and to Ukraine. They demand the demilitarization of Ukraine, the insurance that Ukraine will not take part in the NATO. This is the main thing that Russia will demand to the West, and of course the denazification of Ukrainian policy. But this is an issue that can be discussed about how practically can be done in Ukraine. I think this will remain the request of Moscow for future peace agreement or a ceasefire. It's important to remember that Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Minister of Russian Federation, refused any ceasefire agreement. He repeated a lot of times that he will not, is not interested to frozen this conflict. Russian Federation want to resolve the conflict with a peace agreement, but it's not interested to freeze the conflict with a ceasefire agreement.
Yes, and Keith Baz, as we finish this discussion, European leaders talking about Russia ending its aggression, overnight strikes in Ukraine, targeting buildings that include residential blocks. Is there a fear within European leaders and within European circles that Putin's not going to stop this war, but also that he might look further west at other European nations afterwards?
I think that is always going to be a fear. I think it's unjustified. I think there were specific reasons why he felt he should target Ukraine, but who knows? We are in a completely different landscape. We're not in Kansas anymore. It's totally different. The election of Donald Trump, with his foreign policy being made every single day in news conferences, all those executive orders, obviously it's a very exciting time for news journalists. But I think for the people of the world, it's a very frightening time, and we need to pace ourselves. I think European leaders need to be able to use the chemistry of their relationships in a much more aggressive way, as we saw yesterday. They were able to get together and have a discussion very simply and very quickly. They didn't have to do it through Zoom. They all met in Paris, and now they have something of a collective line. But there are lots of other EU countries such as Latvia, Lithuania, you know, they are right at the edge of Russia, and therefore they're going to be very fearful. Finland wasn't invited to the meeting, but it has most to lose. Poland was there, of course. They are probably the most aggressive in terms of dealing with the Russian government, and there are fears about Romania, Moldova, all these countries. So this is a big, big moment in history. It requires statespeople taking their place and not posturing. And let's hope the European leaders are able to have one position, stick to it. It's very, very difficult to do that with countries all who have their own interests, everyone trying to avoid tariffs coming onto their countries, Britain trying to do its own thing, the EU acting collectively as far as it can, Hungary doing its own thing within the EU. This is a big moment. Everyone in Europe needs to be united in support of the people of Ukraine, no doubt, because actually, in their minds, though I don't think that actually it will happen anywhere else, but who's to know in this current age, but they need to support the people of Ukraine, but more than anything else, support the peace process. No more dying, no more people being destroyed, buildings being destroyed. I went to Kiev 20 years ago. God knows what it must be like now in terms of the photographs and videos that we've seen. I think everyone welcomes the fact that there are peace talks, but how they go is something that we need to monitor on a minute-by-minute basis.
Absolutely, and we will be monitoring that as they come through and as the peace talks continue over the coming days and weeks. Thank you, Keith Vaz, thank you, Ross Feingold, and also thank you to Andrea Lucidi.